In the early 1990s, a country in southeastern Europe began to come apart. Yugoslavia had been a federation made up of 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia, later known as North Macedonia. For decades, it had held together different peoples, languages, religions, and regional identities under one socialist state. But between 1991 and 2001, that federation collapsed into a chain of separate but connected conflicts. These were not one single war with one front line. They were wars of independence, ethnic conflicts, insurgencies, and political struggles that unfolded across different territories at different times. By the end, Yugoslavia no longer existed, 6 independent countries had emerged, and the region had suffered enormous human loss, displacement, and destruction. To understand why the wars happened, it helps to understand what Yugoslavia was. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was built as a multi-ethnic federation after the Second World War. Its republics had their own institutions, but they were tied together by a central state, a communist political system, and the legacy of wartime resistance. For years, the federation's leadership tried to balance competing national identities. Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Montenegrins, Albanians, and others all lived within its borders, sometimes concentrated in one republic, sometimes mixed across towns and regions. That mixture made the country rich in culture, but it also meant that when the central system weakened, political arguments over borders, rights, and sovereignty could become explosive. The breakup is often linked to rising nationalism and unresolved ethnic tensions, but those tensions did not act alone. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Yugoslavia was facing deep political and economic stress. The communist system that had helped hold the federation together was losing authority across Eastern Europe. Economic hardship made distrust worse, and Republican leaders increasingly framed problems through national interests. Instead of asking how Yugoslavia could be reformed, politicians and voters began asking who would control territory, whose security would be guaranteed, and whether each republic should remain in the federation at all. In that atmosphere, nationalism became not just a cultural feeling, but a tool for power. One of the most important institutions in this crisis was the Yugoslav People's Army, known as the JNA. At first, the army presented itself as the defender of Yugoslav unity. Its official goal was to preserve the federation and resist separatism or nationalist forces in the republics. But as the political crisis deepened, the JNA became increasingly associated with Serbian and Montenegrin interests, especially under the influence of Slobodan Milosevic, the dominant Serbian leader. Milosevic's government used Serbian nationalism as a new source of legitimacy as communism weakened. This shift changed how many non-Serbs saw the army. Slovenes, Croats, Bosniaks, Kosovar Albanians, and Macedonians increasingly viewed the JNA not as a neutral federal force, but as an armed instrument of one side. The first open break came in 1991, when Slovenia and Croatia moved toward independence. Slovenia's conflict was short compared with the wars that followed, partly because its population was more ethnically compact and the strategic stakes were different. Croatia's war was much more destructive. Large Serb communities lived inside Croatia, and many rejected separation from Yugoslavia if it meant living in an independent Croatian state. Fighting erupted between Croatian forces, local Serb forces, and the JNA. The conflict was not just about whether Croatia would be independent, it was also about which territories would belong to whom, and whether borders inherited from Yugoslavia would become international borders. This question would haunt the entire breakup. The idea of redrawing borders became one of the most dangerous forces in the wars. According to a 1994 United Nations report, the Serb side was no longer simply trying to restore Yugoslavia. Instead, it aimed to create a greater Serbia by linking areas of Croatia and Bosnia where large Serb populations lived. Other nationalist projects were also discussed or pursued in different forms, including ideas of Greater Albania connected to Kosovo and Greater Croatia connected to parts of Herzegovina. These visions treated mixed territories as pieces of a national puzzle. But real communities did not fit cleanly into nationalist maps. Villages, towns, and cities often contained neighbors from different backgrounds, making any attempt to create ethnically defined states violent in practice. The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina became the most devastating conflict of the Yugoslav breakup. Bosnia was exceptionally diverse, with Bosniaks, Serbs, Croats, and others living in deeply interwoven communities. When Bosnia declared independence, competing national projects collided inside the republic. The result was a brutal war involving Bosnian government forces, Bosnian Serb forces, Bosnian Croat forces, and outside support from neighboring states at different stages. Cities were besieged, civilians were targeted, and territory was seized through violence and intimidation. Bosnia showed the full horror of what happened when political leaders tried to transform a mixed society into separate ethnic territories. The front lines were military, but the victims were often civilians. The Yugoslav Wars became notorious for war crimes. These included ethnic cleansing, massacres, crimes against humanity, mass wartime rape, and genocide. Ethnic cleansing meant forcing people from their homes because of who they were, often through terror, murder, detention, and destruction of property or religious sites. In Bosnia, the violence reached a level that would later be formally recognized in international law as genocidal. The Bosnian genocide was the first wartime event in Europe to be legally classified as genocide since the campaigns of Nazi Germany. This classification mattered because it showed that the conflict was not merely a tragic civil war or a chaotic breakup. It involved organized crimes against civilian populations. The human cost was enormous. Estimates differ, but the International Center for Transitional Justice has put the death toll at about 140,000 people, while the Humanitarian Law Center estimates at least 130,000 casualties. Beyond the dead and wounded, millions were affected by displacement, fear, and economic collapse. Refugee columns became one of the defining images of the wars. Families fled towns where they had lived for generations, often carrying only what they could hold. Some crossed newly created borders. Others became internally displaced, unable to return to homes that had been destroyed, occupied, or made unsafe. The wars did not just redraw political maps, they remade the lives and memories of entire communities. International involvement grew as the wars continued. European governments, the United Nations, and later NATO all became involved in different ways, from diplomacy and peacekeeping to military pressure. Peace agreements eventually ended most of the fighting and brought international recognition to the new states that emerged from Yugoslavia. But diplomacy was slow, and peace often came only after years of violence. One important example was the Washington Agreement in 1994, which helped end fighting between Bosniak and Croat forces and shifted the balance in Bosnia. Later negotiations would bring broader settlements, but the peace was not a simple return to normal. It created new political structures while leaving deep wounds and unresolved grievances. Justice became another central part of the post-war story. The United Nations established the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. Its mission was to prosecute individuals responsible for serious war crimes committed during the conflicts. This was historically significant because it challenged the idea that leaders, commanders, and officials could hide behind the chaos of war. The tribunal investigated crimes committed by different sides and charged many key figures. Its work was controversial in the region, where communities often remembered the wars through competing narratives of victimhood and blame. But internationally, the tribunal became an important step in modern war crimes law and transitional justice. By 2001, the main cycle of Yugoslav conflicts had ended, but the consequences remained. Yugoslavia's breakup produced independent states, new borders, and a changed political order in the Balkans. It also left behind destroyed economies, traumatized survivors, divided communities, and arguments over memory that continue today. The wars are often described as among Europe's deadliest armed conflicts since the Second World War, not only because of the number of people killed, but because of the deliberate targeting of civilian life. The lesson of the Yugoslav Wars is not that diverse societies are doomed to collapse. It is that when institutions weaken, economic fear grows, and leaders turn identity into a weapon, political crisis can become catastrophe. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.